Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before his presence with singing. Welcome to Bible on the Go with Dr. Dan. The Poetical Books are a unique set of literature in the Old Testament. The Poetical Books include Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Job. Each one of these books is distinctive one from the other. Let's talk about them. The first thing we need to know about the Poetical Books is that this body of literature is unique to one period in Israel's history. During the united monarchy of Israel, the reign of Saul, David, and Solomon, around 1,000 years BC. 1,000 years before Jesus, when the kingdom was at its height, when it was richest, and when there was wealth to spread around. During the reign of Solomon, for example, as he exploited the trade routes between Egypt and Mesopotamia and built the wealth and the storehouses of Israel, the arts also flourished. The literary arts and the music arts, and this is where we place Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Job. First, let's talk about the Psalms. Of course, all 150 Psalms are individual songs, S-O-N-G-S. They were written for praise, for worship, to express sadness at times, and even to express anger. Sometimes they were celebratory, like to celebrate the coronation of the king. And each psalm is unique in its message. A lot of times you find the psalmist asking questions. Lord, why do I suffer so much? Why does it seem like evil men prevail against me? Sometimes the psalm is very angry. These are called imprecatory psalms, where basically the psalmist is letting it all out before God and telling him exactly what he thinks should happen to his enemies. What do these psalms do for us? Well, of course, the praise psalms are good illustrations of how we should live in an attitude of praise to the Lord. Now, since Christ has come in the New Testament, we should have the praise of God on our lips perpetually. But in the psalms, we learn how to praise. We learn how to write songs of worship and praise to the Lord, and how appropriate it is. Great is the Lord, and worthy of praise, the psalmist declares. These personal imprecatory psalms teach us that we should not be afraid to tell the Lord exactly how we're feeling. He knows that we're dust. He knows what we're made of. He knows that we have emotions, and when we're angry or frustrated, we should bring those problems to him. As the old song said, tell it to Jesus. The Psalms tell us how to praise, worship, and how to live on the face of the human experience. Proverbs is quite distinctive from Psalms in that it's not songs at all. It's two-statement truths about God. Two-statement truths about God, two-statement truths about how to live. Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider its ways and be wise. There are statements in the positive and in the negative that illustrate one truth. There are statements about the borrower being servant to the lender, and statements about finance, hard work, wisdom. In fact, the first 6 chapters are essays on the value of wisdom and getting what you can from wisdom. Proverbs are good advice for everyone. A lot of people suggest that we read a different proverb every day, since there's 31, and we could read through them in a month and get those good ideas and that good advice worked into our soul. Proverbs is its own type of literature. It's literally a set of proverbs, proverbial thoughts, good ideas, good advice, logical, good wisdom. Ecclesiastes is completely different from Psalms and Proverbs. Ecclesiastes, in fact, starts off in a very odd way. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Everything is meaningless. Well, what we notice from Solomon, the author, is that he tried everything. He tried not withholding any kind of pleasure from himself, and he found that was meaningless. He tried great building projects, and he found that was meaningless. He tried to be a family man. He found that was meaningless. In fact, I tease my students not to read Ecclesiastes when they're depressed. I also say, for example, Ecclesiastes is the country western music of the Old Testament, because everything's gone wrong. Everything that was supposed to work out didn't work out. That's Ecclesiastes. What's interesting about Ecclesiastes is at the very end, Solomon says, there's only one thing to remember: fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. It's the moral to the story. And really, Ecclesiastes teaches us that there's only one thing meaningful in this life, and that's to make God a priority and follow his purpose and his plan. Ecclesiastes isn't like Proverbs. Proverbs isn't like Psalms. And none of these three are at all like Song of Solomon. Again, I teach my students, I tease my students, if you're going to read Song of Solomon, make sure you read it in King James. That way you have no idea what it's saying. Well, Song of Solomon is a love story. It is a picture of biblical sexuality. One man and one woman in love with each other. And so, the book of Song of Solomon tells us that God cares about every part of our life. Well, that's enough about Song of Solomon. How about that last book in the Poetic Books? It's a big one. Job. Job is a poetical book because it has repetition in the narrative. It's referred to as a poetic narrative. Well, Job starts off with this story of, in the first few verses, we discover that he's wealthy, he has 10 children, he's one of the most richest men of the ancient Near East, and yet he experiences multiple tragedy, one thing upon another. And when the sons of God came to present themselves to the Lord, Satan also came with them. How in the world did that happen? We don't know. That's part of the poetic element where it draws us into the story, and we want to know, what's God going to say to the devil? The devil challenges God and says, look at Job. You've put a hedge of protection about him. Take away that hedge of protection and he'll curse you to your face. God says, okay, you can do whatever you will to him, only don't take his life. And the first time he takes all his stuff away and his children are killed in a storm, and it's just multiple tragedies, one on top of the other. And then at the second interface, God allows him to afflict Job's body, and he has sores all over his body from the top of his head to the sole of his feet. What's interesting about all this, in the book of Job, through the more than 38 chapters in the book, something like 40 chapters in the book of Job, he never accuses God of wrongdoing, but he sure tries to figure out why in the world is this happening to him. Like Ecclesiastes tells us about the limits of human reason in the search for meaning, Job tells us about the limits of human reasoning in addressing the problem of evil. Evil is out there. The darkness is out there. But God is superintending all of it. The whole time, God has been watching over Job. And at the end, he is healed from his diseases, his life is spared, and he discovers, when God finally speaks, that God basically doesn't just say, oh, Job, you did such a great job, I'm so proud of you. Rather, he gets on to the friends for saying things that weren't right about God to Job, and saying maybe Job could pray for you. we discover that Job has done well in the book of Job. But does he ever know why all those things happened to him? Well, on this side of eternity, maybe we'll never know. But certainly, the book of Job is a book of poetry. Just like Song of Solomon is a book of poetry, Ecclesiastes is a book of poetry, Proverbs and Psalms are also books of poetry. The Poetical Books, 1,000 years before Jesus. Each one of these was intended by God to be in His Word, to show us the beauty and the variety of human experience, and that God is sovereign over all. Thanks for watching Bible on the Go with Dr. Dan. Hit that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell to be reminded of new content. Praise God!